dozens and dozens and dozens of videos by the RSF themselves to show that the types of killings, systematic killing, particularly of unarmed civilians.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end.
Right now, all eyes are on Washington. But who's actually watching Europe at the moment?
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language.
The IDF will continue to uphold the ceasefire agreement and will respond firmly to any violation of it.
The war in Sudan broke out in 2023, but it has its roots a few years earlier when a popular pro-democracy revolution overthrew the regime of Omar al-Bashir, the military dictator who'd run Sudan for 30 years. That revolution succeeded largely because the two main armed forces in the country, the regular army, known as the SAF, Sudanese Armed Forces, and an irregular militia nominally loyal to Bashir, called the Rapid Support Forces, both teamed up with the protesters to overthrow him. Now, in theory, both the Army High Command and the Rapid Support Forces signed up to the idea of a democratic transition, but it wasn't long before they sidelined the civilians and the Democrats, installed their own military dictatorship, and then not long after that they both fell out. Finally, the two armed forces came to blows in April 2023, and they have been fighting for control of the country ever since. There is a macabre timetable to the way atrocities come to light. They begin with warnings that something horrible is afoot. All too often, those warnings are ignored. Then there are fragmentary eyewitness reports of things too horrible to lend credence to. Then the witness testimony becomes a flood, too consistent to ignore. And then come the photographs, the satellite imagery, and in today's world, videos shared instantly on social media, all of it corroborating the unimaginable. That is exactly what's happening today in the Sudanese city of el-Fasher, which fell to the so-called Rapid Support Forces on Sunday. You can read much more about what's going on, or what we know about it, on the Telegraph website, but I think it suffices to just read out this part of one of today's stories. Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, the World Health Organization chief, he said 460 patients were killed and their companions were killed by the Rapid Support Forces at the city's last maternity hospital. There is a video filmed by RSF fighters. I have watched it. If you really want to, you can find it. It shows soldiers in a ransacked hospital strewn with scores of bodies. One wounded man is shot at close range before the camera pans to a courtyard filled with corpses. The Sudan Doctors Network, a medical group tracking the war, described the scene as a human slaughterhouse. And indeed, the blood in the streets can even be seen from space. It is a horrific moment in a horrific war. But how did things come to this? Who is culpable? And why is the outside world apparently unable or unwilling to do anything about it? I'm joined today by Kholood Khair, a Sudanese political analyst and the founding director of Confluence Advisory, and Michael Jones is a senior research fellow for terrorism and conflict at the Royal United Services Institute in London. Kholood, if I could start with you, what do we know about what is happening in el-Fasher, and what don't we know? I referred there to kind of how difficult it can be to get an accurate picture of these things as they emerge, even though you kind of know that something terrible is happening.
The bulk of what we know about what's going on in el-Fasher right now is actually as a result of the videos that the RSF themselves are taking of the atrocities that they're committing. There's been a telecommunications blackout in Sudan from February of last year, 2024. And because of that, it's been very difficult to get information out, accepting information that comes out through, for example, aid organizations, what is left of them, and, for example, neighborhood organizations like the resistance committees that were part of a network of neighborhood organizations that brought down the Bashir regime in 2019. And they can only get access to the internet through Starlink, which is often also controlled by the Rapid Support Forces themselves. So there's a very small, very difficult telecommunications environment. But right now, what we're seeing is dozens and dozens and dozens of videos by the RSF themselves of the atrocities they're committing, sometimes from a first-person perspective, sometimes showing themselves almost in selfie mode, and the sort of very grim impunity that they enjoy, decades of impunity that they have enjoyed, is really sort of front and center here. But the audacity really to show that the types of killings, systematic killing, particularly of unarmed civilians, in fact, almost exclusively of unarmed civilians, is seen mostly through their own videos.
And those videos they're shocking in how casual they are. I found myself watching some yesterday, and it's literally kind of a man almost as an afterthought raises his rifle and just shoots someone dead. It's mad. From what you say, we're relying on that. There are also these satellite images which seem to show bodies in the street and bloodstained ground. From what you say, that suggests, in terms of specific numbers and details about what's going on, that is yet to come. It's difficult to put specific figures on the scale of the tragedy at this moment.
Well, we can extrapolate from what we do know. The United Nations, before the fall of el-Fasher, said that there were around 260,000 people, mostly civilians, in el-Fasher, with half of those, 130,000 children. Now, a nearby town, Tawila, to the south of el-Fasher, has been something of a safe haven because it is under the control of a different armed group. And the people that are coming into el-Fasher are only numbering about 5,000. That leaves a huge discrepancy. And so we know that there are a few people also leaving through the north of el-Fasher, although that is very, very difficult and very few of them make it out. So that leaves a lot of people still in el-Fasher, effectively at the mercy of the RSF, in an attack, in a series of attacks and massacres that we knew were coming for more than 550 days.
Can I ask you, and forgive me for being so blunt, but why are they doing this?
So there are several sorts of characterizations of this conflict. This conflict, to me, very much is a war against civilians. And we have seen this throughout the 2.5 years since this war came to Khartoum. This war is a result of, it's almost a culmination of the conflicts that we have seen in Sudan's history, but in particular, the war that started in Darfur 20-something years ago. That war, of course, was much characterized by the same kind of patterns of violence that we're seeing now, sort of systematic atrocities amounting to genocide. The world was very much convinced and in agreement that it was a genocide 20 years ago, has been very slow catching up to the kind of violence we're seeing today, which to my mind is very much a continuation of that of 20 years ago, but with a few new characteristics. This time around, the RSF is not just some, ramshackle group of pastoralists on horseback supported by a government in Khartoum. This time around, they're much better resourced, much better funded, much better equipped paramilitary group that is getting a lot of support from particularly the United Arab Emirates, but also regional countries that surround Sudan. And it has become this behemoth, if you will, this military entity that is at once very well-resourced, very sophisticated in its weaponry, and at the same time very primitive, if I can use that word, and very sort of locally motivated in the way that it is carrying out this violence. So many of those who make up the RSF have local grievances and are using this war that is taking place at the national level to sort of settle scores with communities that they believe have had an unfair advantage over the past, decades.
Okay. So just to ask the question a kind of slightly different way, I mean, put me if you can, in the shoes of an RSF fighter who's just gone into el-Fasher and has decided he's going to take part in a massacre in a hospital. Why is he doing that? Has he been ordered to do it? Is it just the nature of this war that prisoners are not taken, or are they just off the leash and undisciplined?
I think it's a combination of several factors. One is that the RSF is actually not a fully functioning military outfit as we might recognize it elsewhere. It is more of a franchise where pastoralist communities have effectively bought into the RSF brand. They get a gun, they get a uniform, and they're able to then sort of eke out these local interests, so they're able to settle scores based on decades-long grievances, but at the same time fight for a more national cause that is embodied in the RSF and what they've been trying to achieve for several years now, even before this war really came to Khartoum. And so if you are a member of the RSF, most likely you are a member of the pastoralist communities that the RSF is trying to cultivate into a constituency, and you've been trying to get this town, el-Fasher, for more than 550 days, and you have been facing fierce resistance, mostly from local communities as well as Darfuri armed groups. And so now that they have el-Fasher, I think there's been a lot of pent-up frustration that is now showing in the sort of depravity that we're seeing. That is, of course, by no means an excuse, but a lot of these soldiers that we're seeing through their own videos are also quite young, probably not very well trained. And there have been concerns about the level of command and control that the RSF has over some of these troops that it has on the ground. All that is to say, there is a combination of very grave factors that means that the RSF is, an entity now that is almost completely unleashed. It is not an entity that is very able, I think, to assert control over its troops, which makes international, calls by the United States, by the United Nations and others for the RSF as what we know as a genocidal militia to exert some kind of accountability and to exert a reserve and restraint on its soldiers even more laughable.
Michael, you wrote in a piece for Rusi this week that the fall of el-Fasher marks a dangerous milestone in the conflict in the Sudan, effectively partitioning the country between East and West. I was wondering if you could explain what you mean by that, but perhaps first, can you just paint us a picture of the state of the national battlefield in Sudan and who is winning, if such a thing can be said?
The conflict, continues to be both protracted and also reflective of the fact that you have these fluctuations at a sort of tactical or operational level, but really that hasn't necessarily sort of fed into seismic changes beyond a couple of sort of key milestones. So the RSF initially was very effective in capturing large swathes of the country and the majority of Darfur, with the notable exception of el-Fasher up until events over the weekend. And in the sort of early phase of the war, also seized the capital Khartoum. The army was able to reclaim that back in late March this year. And so you've sort of seen a little bit of momentum accruing around Sudanese armed force offensives around the sort of south and center of the country. El-Fasher sort of coincides with a few other advances the RSF has made further south, particularly in Kordofan, where it's made inroads into several key cities and sort of transport hubs. And so you're sort of back to this stasis, effectively, a very sort of fluid and yet static status quo of these two armed coalitions that don't seemingly have the capabilities to militarily defeat one another.
I wanted to move on to the role of outside powers here. And Kholood, you already mentioned the UAE, and I think we're just going to have to take that head on, really. I think I'll start, though, by asking you, Michael, about this, because it's kind of a military question. The Wall Street Journal reported that both the US Department of Defense's intelligence agency and the State Department's intelligence bureau had both reported an increase in the flow of weapons from the UAE to the RSF, including advanced Chinese-made drones, along with small arms, heavy machine guns, vehicles, artillery, mortars and ammunition. We also had the report earlier this week that British equipment supplied to the UAE, specifically small arms targeting systems and engines for Emirati armoured vehicles, were also found in the hands of the RSF. There had previously been reports of Bulgarian mortar rounds that had been exported to the Emiratis showing up there. And of course, in 2024, the UN panel of experts concluded that reports of Emirati support for the RSF were credible. The Emirates have always denied all this. I'm going to ask you, Kholood, in a second about why and so on. I'm interested, Michael, whether you can tell us about how, militarily, how important is all that kit for keeping this war going? I mean, is the RSF basically dependent on this?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we've seen over the course of the conflict sort of proliferation of increasingly sophisticated hardware and military assets, including, as you mentioned, sort of heavy weaponry, armored vehicles, UAVs, various forms of sort of long-range drones and loitering munitions and so on, which has made a significant sort of tactical and operational difference in certain respects. It's obviously changed the nature of both urban and rural warfare, particularly with the battle around Khartoum. You saw both SAF and the RSF deploying various drones, be them sort of foreign manufactured and foreign supplied drones, or sort of domestic derivatives and sort of makeshift or improvised drones being used street by street to increase sort of military capabilities and the surveillance capacity of both the RSF and SAF. But I would sort of caution around overstating the impact of that. The influx of drones has been an ongoing feature of the war really since late 2023, early 2024. And yet the significant shifts that we have seen, particularly the sort of recapture of the capital by SAF was primarily driven by a massive ramp up in manpower. The army has increasingly become dependent on various militia groups, community self-defense forces, other paramilitaries, really a wide-ranging confection of different armed groups that to greater and lesser degrees operate along fairly autonomous command and control lines. That massive ramp up in manpower combined with strategic limitations within the RSF, particularly the fact that they had to concentrate resources around the siege in el-Fasher, the fact that their own war coalition is, as has been mentioned, a sort of franchising operation. So you have fragmentation and disorganization between these different groups, and overstretched supply lines, particularly from the sort of heartlands in Darfur to RSF garrisons in Khartoum, meant that this combination allowed those sort of key breakthroughs. Yes, key advances in tech have made a difference, but ultimately the seismic changes that we are seeing in key locations is primarily driven by strategic weaknesses of one side or another, combined with the massive ramp up in manpower that both coalitions are now deploying on the battlefield.
And Kholood, let's just take that bull by the horns. The UAE, how involved are they, and why? And what is their goal here if they are indeed the force backing the RSF?
They're very involved, and they have been, from the outset, from April of 2023. I would differ slightly with Michael in saying that the volume of weapons that we have seen the RSF get from the United Arab Emirates coming through the port or the base. They have a base in Bosaso in northern Somalia, and then via either southern Libya or earlier on in the war, eastern Chad. Those supply lines have been going gangbusters for the past maybe year. Ever since it looked very certain at the beginning of the last dry season, so September, October of last year, that the Sudanese armed forces was very well positioned with support from Egypt and others to take back the capital, which is geographically located in the center of the country. We saw this ramping up of UAE weapons just in the past month. OSINT investigators have shown that about 57 flights full of weapons have come in through Libya, through Bosaso initially in Somalia, and then through Libya from the United Arab Emirates to the RSF. So they have been gearing up for this all through the rainy season. And now that it's the beginning of the dry season this year, we have seen them really launch not just this attack in el-Fasher, but also in the southwestern Kordofan region of Sudan and cities like Bara, etc., but also lying on a road back to Khartoum. So we can see very clearly that militarily, they still insist on going back into the center. They won't just be satisfied with Darfur and the Kordofans. They want to make it all the way into the capital and then potentially into the Red Sea, which they have said and have maintained since the beginning of this war as their main military objective. And so, the question is, why are they doing it? What does the UAE have to gain with one, sort of Sudan's war, and two, prosecuting this war in this way? Now, we have to remember that the UAE is a relatively young country. It's about 50 years old. In terms of foreign policy, it's only really started to make these forays, if you will, into foreign policy in the past 10 or 15 years or so. We have seen the impact of that in Libya. We have seen the impact of that in Yemen. And we will continue to see the impact of that in places like Sudan and also in the Levant. What their foreign policy, their very militaristic foreign policy, seems to be underpinned by is this sort of preference for separatist or non-state actors, and that they're able to prop up effectively to eke out or assert a level of control over countries that have otherwise proved quite unwieldy, whether it's Libya that has sort of this propensity towards a sort of Islamist light regime under Dbeiba, or whether it's the Houthi regime in the sort of Shia Iran supporting Houthi regime in Yemen, whom they also don't like. In Sudan, they have very much characterized the Sudanese armed forces as an Islamist army, which in large part is true. The Sudanese armed forces has been infiltrated by the Islamists since pretty much the late 70s, and of course was very much part and parcel of the Islamo-military regime that ruled Sudan for 30 years until 2019. But all of that is sort of in the background to the economic interests of the United Arab Emirates. Because, of course, remember, the UAE used to do business with the Bashir regime, an Islamist military regime in Sudan. And then suddenly they realized we could probably get more through a group that has a slightly different political outlook, is not ideologically focused or based, but still has, of course, some of those Islamists who are part of the Bashir regime. But they could probably more easily direct in terms of getting some of their foreign policy and economic interests met, specifically around access to the Red Sea, specifically around access to flat arable land, which Sudan has a lot of. You have to remember that the UAE, as well as other Gulf states, have growing populations, but very little agricultural capacity. Countries like Sudan that produce gold. Sudan is Africa's third largest gold producer, and Dubai has arguably one of the world's largest gold markets. But also that strategically, the UAE has started to have these imperialist overtures, particularly in the Horn of Africa, that the Gulf in general sees as its strategic depth. It's very much sees as its playground. And it's very much is becoming a theater of competition between different Gulf actors, particularly the Saudis and the Qataris on one side and the Emiratis on the other. And so Sudan is a foothold, effectively, for the United Arab Emirates, not just in the Horn, again, very strategic, around the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, all the way to the Suez corridor, but also further afield in the Sahel, where the UAE is investing much military engagement as well as other parts of Africa and the Horn and East Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda.
I was speaking to one person yesterday. I pitched the same question, why are they doing it? They put this in the context of what that person described as a kind of a very strategic sphere of influence project in East Africa. You're in Nairobi, I believe, right now. It was described to me as huge investments in Kenya and Ethiopia. You mentioned Chad, Eastern Libya, and so on. I believe, in fact, the Emiratis became the biggest single foreign direct investor into at least that part of Africa in recent years. Just unpack that rationale. Is it possible to see, from the Emirati point of view, the war in Sudan as part and parcel of that effort?
Well, in terms of, I think it's very difficult to get a read on what Abu Dhabi is thinking, because, of course, they don't really communicate or advertise their foreign policy in any sort of clear way. But what we can see in terms of the impact of the Emiratis' engagement in Sudan is that they see Sudan as the fulcrum through which a lot of their foreign policy, but also business and economic interests will play out in Africa. In large part, they're doing this because of several, to my mind, two main reasons. One is they don't want to be the junior partner to Saudi Arabia in their own region. Saudi Arabia is the biggest economy in the Gulf. It's the largest population in the Gulf. It's the largest landmass in the Gulf. It has a very young crown prince who is cementing his power and will soon be in a position to be the hegemon of the entire Gulf and Middle East region. And the Emiratis very much want to, under Mohammed bin Zayed, challenge that. And they see that investments in Africa, these military adventures in Africa, also in Yemen, around the Red Sea, around the Mediterranean, is the way in which they assert that. Now, of course, the Saudis and the Emiratis were very much on the same page, particularly in Yemen, but then fell out. And as soon as that falling out happened, we saw this sort of impact reverberate across the Red Sea into Sudan, into Somalia, into this tension between Ethiopia and Eritrea, into Libya, of course, as well. So this is very much part and parcel of that logic. But there's a broader sort of meta anxiety, if you will, by these Gulf states, in particular the Saudis and the Emiratis. And my assessment is that they're worried about de-dollarization and the rise of alternative currencies. Now, they both recently joined the BRICS countries. And of course, there's been a lot of chatter about how the BRICS countries might be introducing a new currency. And if there is a new currency that is produced that challenges the dollar domination of the world economy, upon which, of course, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are very much reliant, then they need to be in a position to backstop that currency. They need to be in a position to be in control, monetarily, fiscally, of that currency. And the kind of things you need historically to buttress a currency, a new currency, is, things like data. You've seen the UAE invest heavily in data and data centers, especially through these meetings with Trump. Things like gold or extractive metals, things like, strategic real estate, like ports, which the UAE has been investing in, heavily, either through Abu Dhabi ports or Dubai World. Things like land, which they've been buying huge tracts of all over East Africa and in Sudan as well. And oil, of course, which they have in abundance of, but have already started to develop post-oil plans over. And so these are the kinds of things that we've seen them really cement and entrench their interests in the Horn of Africa, but in particular in Sudan.
Coming up, 20 years ago, Western celebrities and politicians flocked to el-Fasher to decry the genocide then going on in Darfur. But now it's finally fallen, and the massacre is happening inside the city. The West is, well, not silent, but conspicuously absent. Not a whisper of discussion, of intervention, of airstrikes, or of a peacekeeping force. Why not? Just a quick message from the team here. If you're enjoying Battle Lines, and we sincerely hope you are, please leave a review on whatever app or website or other platform you happen to be listening on. It really does help others find this show. And if you've got any ideas or suggestions about topics you'd like us to cover, do get in touch at battlelines@telegraph.co.uk. Now back to the Sudanese political scientist Kholood Khair and Michael Jones of the Royal United Services Institute. I think what's striking to me about what just happened in el-Fasher, one thing that is horribly ironic thing is that actually that is a town that's very familiar to, well, I suppose actually the previous generation, but a whole generation of Western leaders and celebrities passed through. So during the war in Darfur in the 2000s, el-Fasher never fell to the Janjaweed. And it was the place where people would fly, and you had people like Colin Powell and Jack Straw and David Cameron and, of course, George Clooney and people like that all flew into that town to visit the refugee camp down the road when they were saying, look, isn't the genocide that's going on here terrible? Now that town has fallen, and it seems like all of those Western countries are either powerless or irrelevant or simply preoccupied or unwilling to do anything about it. Nobody's talking about, I don't know, intervention or a peacekeeping force or anything like that. It just strikes me that if this was happening in the 1990s or the 2000s, we'd be having different conversations that just aren't happening now.
Yeah, definitely. The UN's independent fact-finding mission based in Nairobi did in its previous reports that have floated the idea of some sort of recommendation around external intervention to safeguard civilian lives and to secure humanitarian access. That was nixed pretty quickly by the UN Secretary General and other UN officials, and there is very little appetite, I would say, from the usual suspects for some form of humanitarian or R2P intervention to engage at any real scale in somewhere like Sudan. That's partially based on past experience where the UN missions have not been massively successful in trying to enforce ceasefires and safeguard civilian lives, particularly in Darfur. There were some successes, but I think particularly how that mission was wrapped up has contributed in certain key ways to some of the local level violence that we're seeing. Likewise, there's very little public or political attention devoted to Sudan in even the UK. I mean, the UK sort of tried to carve itself as a bit of a voice on the global stage around Sudan, and David Lammy in particular was quite vocal in his support for sort of mobilizing international action on Sudan. His transition out of the Foreign Office potentially leads question marks over where some of that energy was being funneled. And even the London conference that we saw in March, it was a well-intentioned exercise, but it didn't translate into anything particularly substantive or meaningful. We're still in this cycle of bilateral or minilateral dialogues, mediation efforts by EU, American, Gulf officials, other partners in the region, and none of that has really translated into anything substantive. So it remains a clear public and media and political vacuum when it comes to European and American attention, I think, around the Sudan issue and where to go from here. And that is a marked qualitative difference to, as you say, what international press, celebrities, humanitarian organizations, civil society writ large were doing to galvanize attention successfully back in the 2000s.
Kholood, what do you make of that? I mean, it was once this cause célèbre, and now...
Let me start with the leverage question, because I think it leads us into why there's no movement at all to safeguard civilian life right now. The Gulf has, middle powers, as we call them, have come into their own in terms of being able to assert foreign policies that are independent of, let's say, the West, on whom, they've been dependent on for patronage for almost their entire existence. But that doesn't mean that the West doesn't have leverage over these countries, in particular the UAE. You have countries like the UAE, the Saudi Arabia, Qatar, that are buying huge real estate. They have huge real estate portfolios in places like London and all over the United States, and in parts of Europe, of course, Italy, France, etc. You have Gulf oil is still very much integral to the markets of Western countries, particularly in Europe. You have trade deals, you have commercial deals of all different types in different sectors. You have the weapons that are being bought by these countries, in particular the UAE, which The Guardian exposed in that expose. And you have the political legitimacy that the West gives to the Gulf, particularly as ever since sort of late Obama era, we saw the West effectively outsource its foreign policy to the Horn of Africa and other parts of Africa to the Gulf. And so there is actually a lot of leverage that can be exercised against the Gulf by the West. They're just not choosing to do so. There are other equities that are deemed far more important than, let's say, Sudan, than, saving civilians in Sudan, that are not being put on the table. And so this is, I think, where we are. And this is why we've seen these, milquetoast statements that talk about, the terrible things that are happening in el-Fasher without ever naming the United Arab Emirates, without ever sort of calling into question and without bringing into light the connections of the UAE and particularly the ruling family of the UAE have in terms of what is, related to what is going on in the country. So the world that we live in today is in a large part a result of Western withdrawal, in particular American withdrawal. And what this has led to is, these much more muscular foreign policies by these countries, in particular the UAE, which has also been funding the United Nations. So the United Nations would find it very difficult, particularly as it's cash-strapped now under the UN80 sort of drawdown. If it becomes increasingly reliant on Gulf money, it's not really able to call out the Gulf in the same way, hold them accountable in the same way. You see the African Union or IGAD countries, the Intergovernmental Authority in Development, the regional bloc that Sudan is a member of, all of these countries increasingly becoming dependent on the largesse, the patronage of Gulf countries. And so it becomes very difficult for them to voice independent criticism of the Gulf. And the R2P norms that, that Michael spoke of, the sort of this responsibility to protect, the action that is usually required after a genocide determination, which the United States has made as of earlier this year in regards to the RSF's actions in Darfur, all of those would have triggered a series of events. The UN Security Council would have been mobilized to set up some kind of peacekeeping force. Today, peacekeeping is almost on life support. The world spends about $3 billion on peacekeeping, but $2.7 trillion on defense. The world has changed, and countries like the United Arab Emirates and Turkey and Iran and others are making use of this in terms of the kind of military adventures they're having in places like Sudan.
There have been kind of peace talks. I mean, has anybody put this to the Emiratis? Has anybody tried to say to them, look, what you're doing, and could you please stop? Or could you exercise some influence on your clients to stop them committing what looks like a Srebrenica, or perhaps even worse than Srebrenica-style massacre?
So I think we're told yes, but privately. But also, that question or that line of questioning supposes that the Emiratis would care to stop this. Right now, they have a particular Teflon status because of these equities that I spoke of earlier with the West.
Equities, you mean all the real estate and cash and money and...
Well, shared interests, let's say, not
shared interests. Okay,
shared interests, right. And not just in the West, but also in the region. The UAE was not just a signatory of the Abraham Accords in 2020, was a chief architect of it, and so it is now seen, particularly by the United States, as a key regional anchor for the safety and the preservation of the Israeli state. And because of that, they've given themselves not just a huge, a very long leash in terms of what they can do, but almost this Israel level Teflon status where no matter how many people whose deaths they can be linked to, it's not going to bring about the kind of response from states in the West that one would expect under previous international norms. You might get, and we're seeing increasingly, a lot of people, publics in the West, recognize the role that the Emiratis are playing in what is happening in Sudan, in these atrocities. But that very seldomly moves the needle because, as Michael said earlier, there's just not the level of attention that, for example, what is happening in Palestine is having. So you're seeing all of these, Sudan is falling through the cracks in many ways. It's not as important as other regional files. There's not enough public attention that would press these countries in the West to sort of do a lot better in their response. David Lammy's response to Sudan was a very key example of this. There was a lot of talk and very, very little action. The London conference that took place, the Quad formation, the US, Saudi, Egypt, UAE, that is now trying to bring about a ceasefire. All of the meetings that have been held by these international setups have actually been used by the RSF as political cover to enact some of the most heinous atrocities that we're seeing. This violence that we're seeing in el-Fasher, it happened exactly at the same time as the RSF and the Sudanese armed forces were in Washington, D.C. to attend Quad meetings. The Zemzem atrocities and massacres that took place in April happened on the day of the April meeting in London. And so there's a way in which conflict parties in Sudan, in particular the RSF, have started to game the system. They know exactly what they can and can't get away with. And unfortunately, they have been proven right.
See, the head of the RSF has said that he's appalled by these reports. He's going to order an inquiry, apparently. Do you have any faith in that?
No, none at all. And it wasn't designed, really, again, to solicit action. He has learned very well from the international community that you can simply condemn something. You can simply say that something must be done without actually ever having to do it. And he's effectively saying that we're going to mark our own homework, which is not at all, I think, conducive to, getting some kind of justice or accountability after this. Actually, in large part, the kind of impunity that we're seeing with these crimes by the RSF, but also atrocities that have been committed by the Sudanese armed forces, is that throughout the very long peacemaking war conflict history of Sudan, every peace agreement that we've had, and there have been very many, has had aspects of transitional justice, accountability within it, but none of it has ever been implemented. And that's exactly what they're counting on. So it's very easy for Himeti to come out and say, we're going to investigate this and we're going to do this, properly, without ever really being held to account. He's actually also copying what the Sudanese armed forces have done. When they were accused by the United States of using chemical weapons in parts of Sudan, they said, we're going to launch an investigation committee and we're going to get to the bottom of this. It's the same kind of political behavior that they're effectively learning from the international community and trolling us with, effectively.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You've seen repeated examples of the RSF allegedly deploying police, field courts, special investigating committees. I mean, this is a well-worn pattern both by the RSF and SAF, and has been for decades. So no, I couldn't agree more on that. It's at best a talking point, but in reality, it's an affectation.
Where's the war going? Michael, you wrote in your piece this week about how, in setting aside the horrific atrocity, which is difficult too, but then militarily, I suppose it means, as you wrote, that it frees up the RSF forces for perhaps other things. Where do we think the war is going from here?
We're seeing, as has been mentioned a few times, increasing attention and concentration of forces in Kordofan, further south. And that really seems to be, at the moment, the front. It's effectively the intersection that sort of joins the RSF's sort of hardlands in Darfur with the sort of key roadways leading back to Khartoum. And so that is really where, strategically speaking, the conflict is now sort of focusing in on, and has been for the last several months. And I think the family of itself is important as a sort of test case for understanding how far SAF and its coalition is actually able to infiltrate areas that are primarily or largely populated by a demography sympathetic to the RSF. A lot of the RSF's sort of so-called social incubators or sympathetic community sort of constituencies are based in Kordofan alongside Darfur, the so-called Alouata. It's effectively a prism of understanding how the army is able to sort of navigate a space that is actually overtly hostile to any sort of external army-led intervention. And so I think that will be quite significant in understanding what this means for SAF pushing forward further west. And likewise, if the RSF is able to make additional advances through Kordofan and again sort of approach Khartoum, whether or not it is able to replicate the success it found early on in the war, which was driven in large part by significant structural deficiencies in SAF, its organization, its scale and makeup, which isn't really there anymore. You're looking at a very different army than you were in sort of April 2023 in terms of its complexion, in terms of its capabilities. And so it's not clear to me how far a military victory for either side is feasible. The other point to mention is that with the capture of el-Fasher by the RSF is able to consolidate supply lines through Libya and Chad, which is it's historically exploited for ongoing supplies of foreign munitions, foreign hardware. But it also gives the veneer of a contiguous state, right? The RSF has been working with the launch of a parallel government to present itself internationally, if not domestically, as a sort of viable government in waiting, a viable sort of working statelet, and that's sort of supplemented by the sort of cosmetic rollout of local civic councils, some sort of service provision, et cetera, which in reality is really just the delegation of authority to its local partners and allies. The premise itself, I think, is It's a pretense. It's for international marketing rather than any sort of coherent governance project in and of itself fronted by the RSF. But with the consolidation of its territorial control of most of urban Darfur, it does lend credence to that superficial idea that you now have effectively two separate Sudans, which of course masks the much more complex reality that we're looking at.
Kholood, would you like the last word? There's lots of things I could ask you, but I'm wondering if there's anything you just want to leave us with, or a message you'd like to get across.
Very briefly, I mean, I think that the way that this war is going is that civilians will continue to die because overwhelmingly those have been the people that have lost their lives in this war. It's not members of the armed factions, not members of militias. We will continue to see a further militarization of the state. The Sudanese armed forces already call for popular mobilizations, that is, people to go into a training camp for 3 weeks and get a gun in order to fight a very much more sophisticated, armed group like the RSF. And so we're going to see these civilian deaths increase. We're going to see more sophisticated weapons being, sucked into the theater of war in Sudan. We're going to see, presumably, if all things, remaining the same, these countries that support either the SAF or the RSF continue to do so with gay abandon and without much international censure. And all of this can really be stopped if there is a proper process, a proper ceasefire and political process that actually doesn't just look at the international picture. We focus on the international picture often because that is a large part of what is driving this. But the sort of the national level politics, and more importantly, the local level politics that's driving much of the violence, needs a sort of political process that is much more comprehensive, that looks at why this war started in the first place. Why is it that Sudan's military continues and military apparatus in its various guises continues to rule this country, and how by doing so it continues to encourage rebellions, effectively encourage competing for the state through armed means. How do you break the cycle of war in Sudan is a question that is, going to be linked to stopping arms flows, particularly by Western allies, going to be linked to dealing with core grievances, with questions about how the state itself is organized, etc. Otherwise, we will see not this, sort of clean split of a Libya-style scenario. We will see a complete balkanization of Sudan. There are already 4 centers of control: SAF, RSF, the SPLM, which is an armed group to the southwest, and the SLM, which is a group in Darfur. And so this balkanization of Sudan will continue. So you get these unruly, conflict-ridden states in a region that is marred by jihadist violence and extremism, that is marred by, sort of ethnic strife, that is marred by, waves of genocide. It is an investment for the international community to look at ending this war, which could last decades, as soon as possible. But in order to do that, the West has to be willing to get its foreign friends in order. It has to be willing to say to them, look, if you don't stop doing this, we will look at sanctions. We will look at cutting off some of the relationships that we have. Anything short of that is effectively the West, sort of co-signing on the deaths of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people in Sudan. And, just one very immediate thing related to el-Fasher is that the only bright spot in all of this horrible wave after wave of atrocities that we've seen, not just in el-Fasher, but throughout Sudan, is that there are these local groups called the emergency response groups and other mutual aid groups. These groups are working on voluntary basis to look after their communities, provide food, especially in times of famine. Famine has been declared in Sudan as early as last year. And they're also helping to, provide safety, particularly for women who have been subjected to rape, and also sometimes men as well. And it's these groups that now need support, particularly after the United States has cut off almost all aid supply. And so when we're looking, what can people do, individuals, states, etc., funding these groups and making sure that they're able to continue to weave back the social fabric that this war has ripped apart in Sudan is so key to helping to present some kind of protective wedge between the civilians of Sudan and the armed groups, including the SAF and the RSF, that mean to destroy them.
Kholood Khair and Michael Jones, thank you very much for joining us on Battle Lines. That's all for today. We'll be back on Monday for our usual beginning of the week episode. Until then, that was Battle Lines. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles and hosted by me, Roland Oliphant, and Venetia Rainey. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others to find the show. To stay on top of all our news, subscribe to The Telegraph, sign up to our Dispatches newsletter, or listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. You can also get in touch directly by emailing battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or contact us on X. You can find our handles in the show notes. The producer is Peter Shevlin, and the executive producer is Louisa Wells.